Chapter 12, Resource Management, Forestry, Land Use, and Protected Areas. Case study is about an old-growth forest in Canada that was slated to be cut down, and there were some protests. Make sure you know the definition of clear cutting on page 343. And then on 344, the definition of an old-growth forest is a forest that has never been logged. Some places were logged 100 years ago and they've grown back, but some places have never been logged. And some species, like the spotted owl, will only live in an old-growth forest, and so they're essential habitat, and that's what the people were protesting. Don't cut it down because it's an important habitat. It's something that's never been logged before. On page 344, know the definition of resource management. Now, our resources are not just forests, but also soils, freshwater, wildlife and fisheries, rangeland, minerals. On this page, make sure you know, it's not in your book, but make sure you know that Africa has the most metal reserves in the world. A lot of the mining is occurring in Africa because they have the most untapped minerals. A lot of our minerals, the easy stuff, has already been mined in the United States. And so you might have minerals that are still there, but they're harder to get at and they're more costly. Make sure you also know what the term maximum sustainable yield is. It's down here at the bottom of page 345, maximum sustainable yield. Going on to the section forest management, make sure you understand why forests are important. Why do we want to make sure that forests are important? And here's a picture of a mature forest. You have all ages of trees, you have some dead trees. Fallen trees provide special habitat for some species. Some birds only like to live in fallen trees and flit around. Now, also, we have here at the bottom, forests are ecologically valuable. Now, this is a good FRQ type of question. Hint, hint. Why do we want to save forests? Why are they important? And you have all of these paragraphs, 1, 2, 3 paragraphs here about the importance of forests. And here's number 4. And then also, forests are economically beneficial as well. So you need to be able to describe the economic benefits of forests. FRQs often have both. FRQ may ask you the environmental impact or the environmental benefit, and also something about economic benefits or economic impacts. Whenever you're asked about an economic something, make sure you talk about money, like the wood that provides jobs when people cut it down, or to build a ship that can transport goods and make money. So whenever you're again asked to write about an economic benefit or an economic cost, you have to talk about money. All right, so we have here at the bottom of page 349 about deforestation. Demand for wood has led to deforestation, so we have a lot of sticky notes on that. So deforestation is a big problem. First problem is that you get soil degradation because of erosion with deforestation. The roots of the trees are not there to hold the soil in place. Species that live in the forest can go extinct, which creates a loss of biodiversity. Some civilizations have collapsed due to deforestation. They cut down their trees, which led to a collapse. We talked about that back earlier this year about Easter Island. When you cut down trees, you add carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which causes global warming, because a lot of times when trees are cut down, they're burned. And then the plant matter is no longer there to sequester CO2. Sequester means to capture and keep. And so trees sequester CO2, which means they keep the CO2 in their tissues. Or they can't change that CO2 into oxygen through photosynthesis if they're not there. Actually, this is a little bit inaccurate. CO2 through photosynthesis actually turns into plant tissues. It doesn't directly turn from CO2 into oxygen. Oxygen comes from other compounds in photosynthesis, but the trees are not there to create oxygen through photosynthesis. But technically, CO2 turns into plant tissues. You also need to know down here at the very bottom of page 350 that a third of the surface of the earth is covered in forest. A third of the land, that is, not the oceans. Make sure you know this figure up here on page 350. Know that we're losing forests in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. We're actually gaining some forests in the recent years. Now, we've cut down a lot of forests in North America and Europe already, but this is in the past, let me look and see. This is in the past few years that we, 1990 to 2000, that we have increased our forest size in North America and Europe. So Africa and Latin America has shrinking forests, and Europe has growing forests through conservation. Now, they already deforested, and we in the U.S. already deforested, but now we're trying to preserve some of those forests and grow some of them back, so that's why in the last few years we've had some gains. Here's a picture of clear cut here, where they basically cut down all the trees in an area. And you can see the U.S. has deforested most of its land. Anything in green here used to be forests, and now we have patches left. This was 1620, and this is 1920. You need to know that Alaska has the most old-growth forest, and that's not in your book, but you need to know it. And also, this is not in your book either. But when you cut down a forest and you have urban development, you have a decrease in evaporation and a decrease in transpiration. You have an increase in runoff, which is soil erosion too. So more runoff from rain. See, trees grab the rain and send it underground into your aquifers, into your groundwater. So when there is less trees, it's just going to run off into rivers and streams, and we're not going to send it underground. Sending it underground is better because it's long-term storage. Rivers don't give us much storage, they go right to the ocean. So you have an increase in runoff and a decrease in groundwater recharging. So these are all things that happen to the water cycle when you cut down forests and you build cities. On page 352, we have deforestation. It is proceeding rapidly in many developing nations. The two countries that have the most rapid deforestation are Brazil and Indonesia. Turning the page to 354, we start talking about some of the publicly owned land in the U.S. Anything that's colored here is owned by us, the people, and it's publicly managed in the U.S. The green is U.S. forests, the pink is the Bureau of Land Management, the browns are national parks. Now, we can do things to this. They're not preserved, except national parks are preserved, but they're managed. They're all publicly owned land, and sometimes we cut down the trees, and sometimes we graze cattle on it, sometimes we mine. But these, again, are all owned by the U.S. government, by the people. And you can see most of it's over here and in Alaska, because what happened is around 1900, we realized we should save some of our land, not give it all away through the Homestead Act or to settlers. We didn't realize that until we had settled all the way from colonial times, all the way across the U.S., and it was right about here as people were traveling west and settling and settling and settling, around 1900, that people went, oh, wait a second, we should keep some of it, we should preserve it. And that's when we started setting aside public land that was going to stay public land forever. And that's why most of it is in the western United States, because we hadn't settled there yet when we decided to start protecting a lot of land. Okay, so down here, fear of a timber famine. We talk about the U.S. National Forest Service was started in 1905 by a guy named Gifford Pinchot, and it manages the use of our national forests. So you can log there, you can camp there and hike there, and they have sustainable use of the national forests. On page 355, we talk about plantation forests. Plantation forests are a piece of land that a company owns, and they'll log it, and then they'll plant a bunch of the same species. Usually it's a species of trees that provide lumber that people want. They're usually a monoculture of the same kind of tree. Think of like a Christmas tree farm. but on a bigger scale. Usually they plant them all at the same time, so they're all even aged, all 10 years old tree and then 20-year-old trees, which gives you way less biodiversity because they're all the same kind of tree and they're all the same age. Sometimes they're called tree farms. Less biodiversity means there's less different kinds of niches for different kinds of animals and critters to live. This is a picture here of a tree farm versus the natural forest, and you can see how different it looks. On page 355, we talk about clear cutting. Now, clear cutting is where you cut all the trees in an area. The problem with clear cutting is that the soil erodes. You have a lot of sun, which changes the different species that live there. Instead of shade species of plants and animals, you have sun species. So you'll still have species, they're just going to be different. Clear cutting is the cheapest method of cutting down trees. It is the safest method for humans, but it's the worst for the environment. It increases the water temperature of the streams and the rivers nearby because there's no shade. And so it can dramatically affect the critters that live in your rivers and your streams due to water temperature. So some alternatives to clear cutting are seed tree or shelterwood system or selective system. And it shows it here. If you have original forest, a clear cutting cuts it all. Sometimes they'll leave a few trees to seed and so the forest can grow back. Sometimes they'll just cut the biggest out of the forest and leave the rest. This is called selection. Selection is the best for the environment, but it's the most dangerous for your loggers because trees can get snagged as they're cutting down and hit people and things like that. And this is your regrowth here. Selection still gives you lumber to use, but also keeps the forest. So it's kind of a compromise between the need for wood products and the need for the forests. It's a good compromise. So these alternatives are more expensive for logging companies and less safe, but they're better for the environment because you have less habitat destruction. Page 358, make sure you know the National Forest Act of 1976 here under public forests may be managed for recreation and ecosystems on page 358. Make sure you know the provisions of this act, basically what it says and what it requires. The next page talks about fire policy. For a long time, we put out all the fires in the U.S. because we thought fires were really, really bad. Smokey the Bear, it was somebody, said, only you can prevent forest fires. And now Smokey says, only you can prevent wildfires. Well, what happened was that we stopped these wildfires and the trees overgrew, and in our area the chaparral overgrew. And so now when things catch on fire, it's enormous, huge fires. And this is what happened in Yellowstone National Park in 1988. We stopped these fires for so many years until we realized we shouldn't. But at that time, the forests were so overgrown that when they caught on fire in 1988, they created mega fires. So now we need to figure out how do we reduce the fuel load and prevent huge fires, because we sort of put ourselves in a pickle. Now we realize fires are important. So when a fire starts naturally, we kind of let it burn in national parks and some national forests. So what do we do now, though? Because we now have a bunch of undergrowth and we have these overgrown forests, and the undergrowth is like too many dead trees that lie on the forest floor, and when they catch on fire, you create mega fires. When you let things burn every 10 years or so, it clears out all that undergrowth. And the Indians used to know that. They used to actually set fires because they made the forest healthier. They cleared out all the dead stuff every few years. Well, we stopped doing that, and we put out all the natural fires caused by lightnings. And so now we have this huge buildup of undergrowth that when things do catch on fire from lightning, we create huge, huge mega fires. So what are we going to do? Well, We can prevent these huge fires by doing a prescribed or controlled burn. We set parts of the forest on fire, we burn it, and then we have it contained so we can put it out immediately. We can do salvage logging. Logging companies can go in and they can clear out the dead woods and sell it. Part of this is the Healthy Forest Restoration Act. Has some of these ideas in this act to help reduce the fuel load and prevent these mega fires. Page 361, Sustainable Forestry is gaining ground. So make sure there's several sustainable forestry ideas in here, and make sure you know several of these on page 361.